Welcome back. Today we are going to consider a company, a fabless chip designer called Lattice Semiconductor. Nick, maybe you can give us a company overview.
This is an awesome business that I actually started following in late 2018 when they appointed a new CEO. It's up almost 1,500% since that time. So that's the intro to Lattice Semiconductor. Dumb decision to not begin buying it when I initially started following it almost 5 years ago now. How's that for an intro?
A missed opportunity is what you're saying. Let's talk a little bit about what exactly this company does, what they design. It looks like they manufacture primarily programmable logic devices, or PLDs. And these are used in a lot of different applications: networking, communications, industrial, some consumer, and automotive as well.
Yes, perhaps more broadly than saying PLDs, we could call these FPGAs, Field Programmable Gate Arrays. If that term sounds familiar, it's probably because you've seen it thrown around quite a bit by AMD. AMD acquired Xilinx early in 2022. They completed that merger with Xilinx, which was the largest FPGA designer. Xilinx is kind of like often credited with the original invention of the FPGA, like 40 some years ago. There's another company in this space called Altera that Intel acquired back in 2015. They kind of doubled down on that and bought another FPGA company called Omnitek just a few years ago. And so all of a sudden, Lattice Semiconductor is like one of the original FPGA companies remaining on the market as a pure play investment in the FPGA space.
Okay, so some of these other companies have been acquired into bigger companies, Intel and AMD, as you mentioned. And I was reading over the earnings call with the CEO, James Anderson, and he said, we help the customer future-proof their platforms. So can you maybe explain a little bit what that means exactly? How does this company and the FPGA do that?
Before continuing, let me remind you to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if this video is helpful as you do your own investment research and increase your knowledge of business and technology. We really appreciate the support, as subscribing to the channel helps us continue putting out content like this. Right. So actually, interestingly enough, by sheer volume of chips produced, Lattice Semi is the largest producer of FPGAs. And that's because they specialize historically in these very small FPGAs that can fit into very small devices. And historically, that's industrial equipment, automotive. So you think like maybe a car, or maybe an industrial manufacturing company, a non-tech business, and maybe they just have like a very specific application they need a chip for, but they don't need enough volume to warrant spending the money on what's called an ASIC, an application-specific integrated circuit. It can be very, very expensive to design a brand new chip for a specific application and then go manufacture it. It only makes sense if you expect to need a ton of those very specific ASICs. So that's where an FPGA comes in. Also, a lot of FPGAs historically are used for like testing, maybe in the field, programming in the field. That's where the programmable comes in the Field Programmable Gate Array. Basically, you can use software to reprogram the logic circuits in these FPGAs. So that's the benefit. A lot of these companies that are non-tech businesses might opt for an FPGA instead of an ASIC. Maybe it's like a microcontroller, kind of like microchip technology, which we covered a couple of weeks ago, or some other ASIC like that. So that's where FPGAs have historically come into play here.
We have a couple slides here from the investor presentation on the portfolio that Lattice has. They have the Avant series and then also the Nexus series. And they plan on expanding this portfolio even more. So what's their strategy here? What is the focus and how is this company going to continue to grow?
So the Avant series of chips is sort of the historical portfolio. Those are those very small form factor FPGAs. And as you can see from the pictures here in the slide, a lot of the markets that utilize these chips are suddenly enjoying a renewed secular growth trend, right? Automotive industry, the share of chips going into the development and manufacture of a car, fastly on the rise. Industrial automation, obviously, a huge growth industry right now as companies try to look for ways to cut costs in the inflationary environment. And then there's the Nexus line, which is a newer lineup of chips introduced in the last couple of years, and they have new chips in this lineup coming out as well. These are actually larger footprint FPGAs that are historically dominated by Xilinx, Altera, those companies that were acquired by AMD and Intel. A lot of these are bigger, more general purpose chips. Maybe they get used in data centers, internet infrastructure, mobile network infrastructure, basically bigger chips, general purpose chips. And after these acquisitions by Intel and then later AMD, I think basically Lattice has seen opportunity here to go out and capture some of this market that they historically have not been all that much exposed to in the past. So an expanding lineup of FPGA chips.
So that's a very interesting point. And another thing that the CEO, James Anderson, mentioned in the presentation was that Lattice is poised to possibly disrupt this position that's been dominated by companies like Texas Instruments, you mentioned Microchip, as well as NXP. How could these FPGAs replace microcontrollers that are made by these companies?
It's a really interesting point that he brought out in this recent investor presentation, and something that I think I missed in the past. But basically, like I mentioned at the outset, ASICs, an application-specific chip like a microcontroller, can be very expensive to develop and then manufacture. And so that's the benefit of an FPGA. Now, it is interesting, Microchip actually also has an FPGA portfolio itself. So you can kind of see how there's some complementary business there between a microcontroller, for example, and an FPGA. But again, I think the flexibility of these chips, the ability to reprogram them after they've been manufactured using software, is a way Lattice sees being able to go after some of this existing business from some of its larger peers. Again, Texas Instruments, which mostly does analog chips, sensors, but a little bit of microcontroller business, as well as NXP, which is a top automotive industry supplier. So interesting here. Lattice growing very quickly the last few years, and they see opportunity to continue that growth, not just from the chip industry overall, kind of propelling them higher, but also being able to get its foot in the door into some new industries.
Yes, they're very well positioned in these markets, aren't they? These markets that we know that are continuing to grow at a rapid pace. That's an interesting point about their software design and that promotion of this stickiness to their products. So how does that work exactly? Can you describe that a little bit?
Right. That's actually, again, going back to the historical competitiveness of the FPGA, that's been a big reason why a company might not use an FPGA. It's flexible in that it can be reprogrammed. Basically, the instruction set governing the logic gates on the chip can be altered so the chip can do something new and different. But you have to know how to do that, right? You need to have a software engineer that knows how to reprogram the chip. So FPGA companies, including Lattice, have been developing software to make that easier for these historically non-tech businesses to buy its FPGAs, and then make it easier for them to reprogram them as they see fit once they've been deployed, once they've been put into use. So you can see that a pretty robust pipeline of software tools that Lattice has developed over the years to help with that.
Okay, that is very interesting. So that actually segues into the one portion of the business that we want to focus on is the automotive section, and how that switching from a microcontroller to this FPGA, using the software to be able to program any changes they want to make, how does that affect their automotive business?
Yeah, it's difficult to understate how quickly the automotive industry is changing. Obviously, electric vehicles are on the rise, but just in general, the amount of computing power going into vehicles is growing exponentially. And so again, historically, microcontroller, which is a very, very simple chip system, basically designed to do one thing and do one thing very well. But these systems are getting more complicated, especially as there's more driver assist systems and a lot of automakers on the path towards developing, some more robust autonomous vehicle tech. Suddenly a microcontroller may not cut it anymore when you have all these different sensors on the car. You need something with some more potent computing power, and obviously the ability to reprogram it to do different computing tasks would be helpful as well. So again, another slide that you pulled here from that recent demonstration, showing some of the different ways FPGAs are getting put to use. Anything from the infotainment system, the in-cabin display, to the actual electric drivetrain, managing the flow of electricity through the vehicle, managing the sensors, you name it. FPGAs have the opportunity to proliferate across the modern vehicle.
I was thinking about this in electric vehicles and the infotainment system, just in that alone, how often that changes and can be updated on a regular basis. It's incredible. And so something like this makes a lot of sense. The hardware doesn't need to change. It's just software reprogramming. So super interesting. I can definitely see how this has application. So let's talk a little bit about the financial performance of Lattice. 11 straight quarters of growth for this company.
Yeah, I'm actually going to say something more impressive than what management has been saying. Let's go back more than just 11 quarters, because that basically is the start of like the early pandemic boom and the end of the early pandemic slump in like March, April, May 2020. If you actually go back to the start of 2018, that's really when Lattice started getting some things sorted out, recognizing it could benefit from some secular growth trends, and kind of cleaned up its portfolio of chips. Again, brought in James Anderson in end of August 2018. He has an impressive pedigree. They poached him from AMD. AMD had taken him away from Intel back in the mid-2000s. So he was at Intel, kind of in Intel's heyday in the late 90s and early 2000s. So they brought him in to kind of orchestrate this turnaround. So they've actually been growing at a pretty consistent clip since then. And along the way, in addition to just growing revenue, this is what we really like to find in a long-term investment, right? It's not just revenue growth, but also profit margin expansion along the way. That's where that big, giant 1,500%, roughly 1,500% stock price return has come from in the last basically 5 years. Revenue growth and profit margin expansion. And it actually looks like that is going to continue. So the outlook for the first quarter of 2023, more double-digit revenue growth, roughly, I think about 17% is the outlook. An outlook for gross margin expansion again on products sold. So further increase in earnings per share. It's like that really impressive trend that started in 2018 is going to continue at Lattice. So that's awesome. Again, big dummy here. I didn't start nibbling on the stock when I first kind of caught wind of it 5 years ago. But if you find a great company, it's never too late to start looking at adding to the portfolio, right?
Like this might be the right time to at least start a position in Lattice Semiconductor. We missed out on some gains there, but oh well, such is life. So what would be what's your valuation of this company and what is the price target?
Okay, well, the valuation is where things get, let's say dicey at the moment. So this thing was cheap if you were looking at the long-term opportunity a few years ago. Maybe now not quite so cheap. About 72 times trailing 12-month earnings and about 63 times trailing 12-month free cash flow as of this recording anyways. So obviously a lot of value investors are probably scoffing right now, maybe didn't even make it to this point in the video. And I actually absolutely agree. I think it is priced to perfection right now. The market has completely caught wind of what's going on at Lattice, and I think has priced in the earnings and free cash flow growth for probably the next 2 years. So I don't think it's the most timely of buys. As far as a price target goes, based on what I'm looking at for the next, let's say 5 years, or until maybe the end of the 2020s, until 2030, I actually do absolutely believe this company can continue to grow in excess of average semiconductor industry growth, which is going to be about 7, 8, 9% on average per year. I think Lattice can actually grow at a low teens average revenue growth rate over that time. The profit margin expansion opportunity is probably not as good as it was, but I do think there is some upside there. So if you're looking at buying and holding for 5 to 10 years, I actually do think the stock is presently, at the moment, fair valued if you look at the long-term opportunity. Again, not the most timely of buys. So basically, I think I'm going to take the easy way out here, as we have been with a lot of the stocks we've been covering lately, and say we're going to nibble, make a very small purchase here, and then take advantage of any dips going forward and add to the position over time. But again, with the intent of holding it for 5 to 10 years, given what we think is going to be a very long-term growth story here at Lattice.
Okay, so it sounds like Lattice has a great opportunity here in the FPGA space. So what about companies that have acquired those smaller businesses like Intel and AMD? They also have that in FPGA business. What do you think about those two?
Yeah, we love AMD, right? And one of our investment theses going forward for AMD is the fact that they acquired Xilinx, what was the largest FPGA company by annual revenue, and still is, but obviously it's kind of buried under the rest of AMD's operations now. We still like AMD for that reason. We think they'll have rising profit margins as they continue to integrate Xilinx. But I do like Lattice and the pure play opportunity it offers for FPGAs. And I think basically what management was hinting at in some of these recent presentations was they see opportunity to grow their market share of the FPGA space, because obviously Intel having lots of issues, cutting costs, paring back investments into chip design. Lattice is kind of doing the opposite. So I think they can scoop up some share versus Intel. And then whenever there's a new integration, an acquisition and integration like AMD is managing right now, there's some opportunity for maybe some customer leakage, if you might say, go to some of the remaining competition out there. So I think that's what Lattice is looking at right now. They're picking up market share. We still like AMD though, over the long term, but I think Lattice is an interesting one to, at the very least, keep on your radar.
Okay, that'll do it for Lattice Semiconductor. Make sure you hit the subscribe button for more great content this week and in the future. Link in the description for our coffee tip fund if you want to leave us a tip. Stay tuned.